Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku invented a mechanical quirk in a world of steam. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The air in Muzidafoot tasted of coal dust, hot metal, and progress. It was a city perpetually breathing, its exhalations rising in plumes of white steam from 1,000 grates and pipes that laced the cobbled streets and clung to the brass filigreed facades of the buildings. Great clockwork towers, their gears turning with the ponderous certainty of celestial bodies, chimed the hours, their tones mingling with the rhythmic chuff of steam trams on their iron tracks and the distant, percussive clang of industrial forges. This was a world built by hand and powered by steam, a sprawling, intricate machine where every citizen was, in some way, a cog. Yet some cogs were cast from a finer metal. A sudden, jarring screech of tortured steel cut through the city's symphony. A public steam tram, a behemoth of riveted iron and polished oak, had broken its regulator and was now careening down the 4th sector incline, its safety whistle screaming a single, desperate note. Pedestrians scattered like startled pigeons, their gasps lost in the hiss of the runaway machine. The automaton constabulary, gleaming brass-plated automatons with flickering gas lamp eyes, whirred and clanked, their programming ill-equipped for such kinetic chaos. Then, from a rooftop, a figure descended. He landed on the street with a ringing metallic thud that cracked the cobblestones. He was the pro-hero, Argent Hand, and his quirk was ferrokinesis. His costume was a practical assembly of reinforced leather and thick canvas, but his arms were bare, revealing flesh that seemed to ripple and flow like mercury. "Stand clear!" His voice boomed, amplified by a small, clockwork voice projector on his collar. The crowd, which had already fled, now stopped to watch, a collective sense of awe washing over them. This was the magic of their age, not the intricate clockwork or the harness power of steam, but the effortless, innate power of the gifted. In the midst of that crowd, half hidden behind a pneumatic message post, a boy with a wild mop of green-black hair scribbled furiously in a worn, leather-bound journal. Izuku Midoriya, 14 years old, was not watching the spectacle with the same star-struck reverence as the others. His focus was sharper, his gaze more intense. His emerald eyes darted from the hero to the runaway tram, not just seeing, but analyzing. Argent Hand's quirk allows for the manipulation of ferrous metals, he muttered under his breath, his pencil a blur across the page. But observe the strain. The mass of the tram is at the upper limit of his control. Note the microfractures forming in the street around his feet as he anchors himself. His support boots must have deep-driven anchor pistons, probably pneumatic, to compensate for the kinetic force. But what about the material fatigue of the tram's chassis? He can't just stop it. The inertia would tear it apart. Argent Hand stretched his arms forward, and they ceased to be flesh. They flowed outwards, becoming thick, gleaming cables of steel that snaked through the air and slammed into the tram's sides, wrapping around its frame. The hero grunted, muscles bulging as he strained to pull the multi-ton vehicle to a halt. The tram groaned, its iron plates buckling under the immense, focused pressure. "Brilliant!" Izuku whispered, his pencil flying faster. "He's not just pulling. He's using his quirk to reinforce the chassis from the outside while simultaneously applying resistive force. He's becoming an external braking system. The energy distribution is incredible. A born talent. A true gifted." The tram slowed, screeching and shuddering, until it came to a halt just inches from a storefront selling intricate brass chronometers. Argent Hand let his metal arms retract, shimmering back into flesh. He was breathing heavily, sweat beading on his brow, but he gave the cheering crowd a thumbs up and a dazzling smile. The people roared their approval, their adoration for this living symbol of power absolute and unconditional. Izuku sketched a final, detailed drawing of the hero's stance, complete with force vector arrows and notes on potential gear improvements. He was so engrossed he didn't notice the crowd dispersing until a sneering voice cut through his concentration. "Still at it, scrap heap?" Izuku flinched, snapping his journal shut. He turned to see Katsuki Bakugo, flanked by his usual sycophants. Bakugo's school uniform was immaculate, a stark contrast to the faint grease stain on Izuku's own sleeve. His crimson eyes held a familiar, simmering contempt. "Keikaken," Izuku stammered, clutching his journal to his chest. "Let me see." Bakugo sneered, snatching the book from Izuku's grasp. He flipped through the pages, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. "Pathetic. Hero analysis. Like a little kid." "Oh wait." He stopped on a more recent page, one filled not with heroes, but with complex schematics. Pistons, gears, pressure gauges, and a design for a miniature, high-pressure boiler. "What's this garbage? Still playing with your junk pile, dreaming you can build yourself a Quirk?" Bakugo's cronies snickered. "He's a cogsmith, Bakugo. It's all they know how to do," one of them said. The term wasn't an insult, not officially. It was a class, a designation. In this world, you were either born gifted, with a quirk woven into your very being, or you were a cogsmith, one of the countless quirkless who kept the great machine of society turning. Inventors, engineers, mechanics, stokers, they were essential, but they were mundane. They were the ones who worked with tools, while the gifted were the tools. Bakugo shoved the journal back into Izuku's chest. "You'll never be a hero, scrap heap. Heroes are born. They have real power. All you'll ever have is grease under your fingernails and a head full of useless gears." He held up his hand, and a series of sharp, crackling pops erupted from his palm, smelling of ozone and nitroglycerin. It was raw, untamed energy. The power of a gifted. "This," Bakugo said, his voice low and dangerous, "is what real power looks like. Remember that." He and his friend stalked off, leaving Izuku alone in the street, the lingering scent of burnt sugar and superiority hanging in the air. Izuku clutched his journal, his knuckles white. He looked from the schematics on the page to his own empty hands. "Useless gears," Bakugo's voice echoed in his head. A familiar, cold despair began to seep into his chest, but this time, something else mingled with it, a spark of defiant, burning anger. The Aldera Junior High classroom was a marvel of educational engineering. Pneumatic tubes whisked assignments to the teacher's desk, and the large blackboard was a complex slate and chalk contraption that cleaned itself with a series of whirring brushes and steam jets. Despite the technological wonders, the social atmosphere was as primitive as ever. "Now, as you're all third years, it's time to start thinking seriously about your futures," the teacher said, his voice droning over the quiet hum of the classroom's ventilation system. He grabbed a stack of pamphlets from his desk. "I would hand out these career aptitude tests, but why bother?" He tossed the papers into the air, and they fluttered down like oversized snowflakes. "I know you all want to go into the heroics track," the class erupted. Quirks flared to life. A girl elongated her fingers into metallic wires. A boy briefly turned his skin to polished oak. It was a chaotic display of innate power, a peacocking of the gifted. Izuku, sitting in the back, hunched over his desk, trying to become invisible. Yes, you've all got wonderful quirks," the teacher placated. "But you know the rules. No quirk usage on school property." "Hey, teach," Bakugo drawled, leaning back in his chair with his feet on his desk. "Don't lump me in with these losers. I'm the real deal. The rest of them will be lucky to end up as sidekicks to some delister, patrolling the industrial districts." The class erupted again, this time with indignant shouts directed at Bakugo. "Ah, Bakugo." "Of course," the teacher said, consulting his datapad. "You've applied to Yui Mechanica Heroics Academy, haven't you?" A wave of murmurs swept the room. Yui was the pinnacle, the most prestigious heroics academy in the world, a place where the gifted were forged into legends. "That's right, the national-level school," Bakugo boasted, a smug grin on his face. "I aced the mock exams. I'm the only one from this garbage-tier school who stands a chance. I'll end up more popular than Argent Hand, and it all starts at UA." "Oh yeah, Midoriya," the teacher said casually, looking down at his datapad again. "You applied to UA too, didn't you?" The classroom went dead silent. The only sound was the slow, steady tick-tock of the great clock on the wall. Then, a beat later, the entire class burst into uproarious laughter. It was a cruel, overwhelming sound. "Midoriya? No way, you can't get into the hero course just by tinkering. He's quirkless. A cogsmith. Did he apply for the support course?" "No, look at the application," someone crowed. "He went for the hero course." The laughter intensified. Izuku felt his face burn with a heat that had nothing to do with steam. He wished the floor would swallow him whole. "There's no precedent for it," he stammered, rising slightly from his seat. "The rules don't forbid a quirkless person from applying. I checked. They might have changed the rules." Bakugo moved faster than Izuku could track. An explosion erupted on Izuku's desk, blasting him backwards. The concussive force sent him tumbling out of his chair and onto the floor. The desk was a blackened, splintered wreck, smoke curling from its surface. "Listen up, scrap heap," Bakugo growled, looming over him, his palms smoking. "Forget the extras. You and I are not on the same level. You think you can stand in the same ring as me with a pile of nuts and bolts?" His voice dropped to a venomous whisper. "You're worse than quirkless. You're a dreamer who doesn't know his place. Don't you dare apply to UA. You'd embarrass this whole school just by showing up." Izuku could only stare up at him, trembling, a mix of fear and frustrated tears blurring his vision. He didn't say a word. He couldn't. The bell, chiming the end of the day, was his only salvation. As the other students filed out, chattering about Bakugo's display, Izuku slowly picked himself up. His ears were ringing. He was packing his bag when he saw Bakugo and his friends waiting for him. His heart sank. Bakugo snatched the hero analysis journal from Izuku's hands again. "We're not done here," he said. "Give it back, Kaken," Izuku pleaded. "It's mine. You're still doing this?" Bakugo said, flipping through it with a disgusted look. He didn't even bother to read it this time. He simply clapped the book between his hands, and with a deafening boom, an explosion tore through it. The force blew the pages apart, sending blackened, burning scraps fluttering to the ground. The leather cover was scorched and smoking. Izuku cried out, a sound of pure anguish. Bakugo casually tossed the ruined book out the open window. It landed with a soft splash in the school's ornamental koi pond below. "You know," Bakugo said, turning back to face the devastated Izuku, his expression devoid of any emotion but disdain. "If you really want a quirk so bad, there's a quick way to do it. Just take a swan dive off the roof and pray you'll be born with one in your next life." And with that, he and his cronies left, their laughter echoing down the empty hall. For a long time, Izuku stood there, frozen. Bakugo's words echoed in the silent room, colder and sharper than any piece of scrap metal. He slowly walked to the window and looked down at his journal, its pages soggy and ruined, floating amongst the lily pads. A single, hot tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He had never felt so utterly, completely alone. The Dagoba Municipal Scrapyard was not so much a yard as it was a mountain range. Rusting hulks of old steam automobiles were piled on top of decommissioned factory boilers, tangled with miles of copper piping and discarded automaton limbs. It was a testament to the city's relentless churn of creation and obsolescence, a graveyard of forgotten technology. To Izuku, it was a treasure trove. He retrieved his sodden journal from the pond, the ink bled into illegible Rorschach blots, and trudged not home, but here. This was his true sanctuary, the one place where the labels of gifted and cogsmiths seemed to melt away under the sheer, overwhelming presence of potential. Every broken thing here had once had a purpose. With enough knowledge, enough work, it could have one again. He bypassed the main gates, slipping through a familiar gap in the corrugated iron fence. He navigated the metallic canyons with practiced ease, his worn boots crunching on a ground made of crushed gears and shattered vacuum tubes. He was heading for his personal section, a relatively secluded corner where a shipment of decommissioned analytical engines had been dumped months ago. Today, he wasn't looking for major components. He needed something small, precise. A regulator valve, something to handle the delicate flow of pressure. After Bakugo's words, after the day he'd had, the need to work, to build, to prove, was a physical ache in his chest. He spent the next hour sifting through piles of brass and steel, his earlier despair slowly giving way to the focused calm of the hunt. His hands, already calloused, moved with purpose, sorting, evaluating, and discarding. Finally, his fingers brushed against it. Tucked inside the chassis of a shattered automaton messenger was a pneumatic actuator, small and intricate. It was dented, but the core mechanism, a set of micro-calibrated pressure regulators, looked intact. His heart gave a hopeful leap. This could work. This could be the piece he needed. With his prize wrapped in an oil rag and tucked into his bag, he made his way home. He didn't enter through the front door of the small apartment he shared with his mother. Instead, he went around back to a small, rickety shed that leaned against the main building. From the outside, it was unremarkable. Inside, it was Izuku Midoriya's soul made manifest. The air was thick with the smell of solder, lubricant, and ozone. The walls were lined with shelves overflowing with neatly sorted components, gears, wires, vacuum tubes, pressure gauges, and salvaged plating. Blueprints and schematics were pinned to every available surface, overlapping in a chaotic but logical tapestry of invention. In the center of the room, on a reinforced workbench under the stark, focused light of a single, powerful electric bulb, was his secret. His defiance. His hope. He called it the ARMS. The Advanced Response Mobilization System. For now, it was just a single gauntlet and bracer. It was not a sleek or elegant thing. It was a bulky, asymmetrical assembly of reinforced steel, brass piping, and tightly wound copper coils. It looked heavy, powerful, and dangerously volatile. A series of pistons ran along the forearm, connected by thick leather straps to the main chassis that housed the heart of the machine, a miniature, high-pressure ether steam converter he had designed and built himself. The ether was the great mystery of their age. A strange, ambient energy that, when properly channeled to a steam-based system, could produce power outputs that dwarfed simple combustion. The gifted were thought to be natural conduits for it, their quirks a biological expression of its power. Izuku believed he could replicate the effect mechanically. He carefully placed the salvaged actuator on his workbench and began the delicate process of disassembly. For the next few hours, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only the click of his tools, the focused beam of his lamp, and the intricate dance of tiny components under his steady hands. He cleaned the salvaged regulators, recalibrated them using a set of fine-tuned calipers, and then began the painstaking process of integrating them into the gauntlet's power flow system. He was so absorbed he didn't hear the shed door creak open. "Izuku? Honey?" He jumped, nearly dropping a microspanner. His mother, Inko Midoriya, stood in the doorway, a tray with a bowl of katsudon and a glass of milk in her hands. Her face, usually so soft and cheerful, was etched with a familiar worry as her eyes fell upon the mechanical monstrosity on the workbench. "You missed dinner again," she said softly. "Sorry, Mom," he mumbled, turning back to his work, his face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and passion. I found a really good pressure regulator. It's perfect for stabilizing the etheric feedback loop in the primary steam chamber." Inko set the tray down on a clear corner of a nearby table. She didn't understand the technical jargon, not really. But she understood obsession. She saw the new burns on his hands, the dark circles under his eyes, the feverish intensity with which he pursued this thing. "That boy, Katsuki," she began, her voice hesitant. "Did he do something again? The school called about an incident with a desk." Izuku froze. He kept his back to her, unwilling to let her see the flicker of pain on his face. "It's fine, Mom. It was an accident. Kaken's quirk is just powerful." "It's not fine, Izuku," she said, her voice trembling slightly. All of this. She gestured around the workshop. "I know how much you want to be a hero. You have your father's brilliant mind and a heart bigger than anyone I know. But this path, it's dangerous. These machines. What if one of them explodes?" All Might himself said. "I know what he said." Izuku cut in, his voice sharper than he intended. He took a deep breath, trying to soften his tone. "I know. He said a machine would tear a normal boy's body apart. He was right. That's why I'm building this." He tapped a section of the bracer where a complex system of spring-loaded shock absorbers was visible. "It's a problem to be solved, Mom. Not a death sentence. I'm reinforcing the joints. I've got emergency pressure release valves. I'm being careful." She looked at him, at the fierce determination in his eyes, and her own filled with tears. Just eat, Izuku. Please." She left, closing the door softly behind her. Izuku stared at the katsudon, his favorite meal. His stomach growled, but the hunger to finish his work was stronger. He ate quickly, his eyes never leaving the gauntlet. His mother's fear was a cold knot in his stomach, but it only fueled his resolve. He wasn't just doing this for himself anymore. He was doing it to prove to her, to Bakugo, to All Might, to the whole world, that a dream built from scratch could be just as real as one you were born with. An hour later, the work was done. The new regulators were integrated, the system triple-checked. A small, clear tube running along the gauntlet now glowed with the faint, ethereal blue light of contained ether, swirling gently within the pressurized steam. Every gauge was in the green. The moment had come. He pulled a heavy, leather blacksmith's apron over his school uniform and strapped it tight. He slid a pair of thick, brass-rimmed welder's goggles over his eyes. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, unsteady rhythm. This was the culmination of years of sketching, scavenging, and secret, feverish work. The target was propped against the far wall of the shed, a makeshift plate of armor he'd constructed from the door of a defunct boiler, and a riveted sheet of scrap steel. It was thick, solid, and unforgiving. With a trembling hand, Izuku slid his left arm into the ARMS gauntlet. It was heavy, the cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth of his skin. He strapped it down, the leather creaking in the quiet shed. The fit was snug, custom-made for his arm. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of oil and anticipation. His thumb found the primary activation switch, a sturdy, satisfyingly chunky lever protected by a safety casing. He flipped the casing open. He hesitated for only a second, Bakugo's taunts and All Might's warnings a cacophony in his mind. He silenced them with a single, clear thought, let's see. He flicked the switch. The effect was instantaneous. A deep, resonant hum vibrated up his arm, making his teeth buzz. The ether tube flared with brilliant blue light. A low hiss escaped from a valve near his elbow as the miniature boiler reached its optimal pressure in seconds. The gauges on the bracer flickered to life, their needles jumping into position. The pistons along his forearm tensed with a soft ch thunk, filled with pneumatic force. He could feel the power contained within the machine, a wild, thrumming energy that was both terrifying and exhilarating. It felt alive. He balled his hand into a fist inside the gauntlet, the metal plates shifting with a smooth, oiled sound. He planted his feet, taking a stance he'd seen heroes use 100 times. He focused on the target plate, his breath held tight in his chest. He drew his arm back, the gauntlet feeling like an anchor. He put all his training, all his analysis, all his desperate hope into a single motion. He punched. The world dissolved into a cacophony of sound and force. There was a deafening crack hiss as the piston system fired at full capacity, slamming his fist forward with impossible speed. For a microsecond, he saw the metal of his gauntlet connect with the target. Then came the impact. It wasn't just a punch. It was a localized explosion. A blast of superheated steam erupted from the gauntlet's vents, momentarily blinding him. The recoil was a physical blow, a brutal shockwave that traveled up his arm, rattled his shoulder in its socket, and slammed him back against his workbench. Tools and components rained down around him. His ears rang. The shed was filled with thick, white steam. His entire arm screamed in protest, a deep, throbbing ache that felt like his very bones had been vibrated into dust. Groaning, he pushed himself up. He looked at his arm. The gauntlet was venting steam from every joint, its internal alarms beeping a frantic, high-pitched rhythm. The ether core was dimming as he hit the emergency shutdown. But it wasn't broken. It had held. Then he looked at the target. His breath hitched. There, in the center of the half-inch thick boilerplate, was a perfect, fist-sized dent. The metal around it was warped and blackened from the heat. It was a mark of impossible power. A mark he had made. He stumbled forward, his legs shaking, and reached out with his free hand to trace the edge of the indentation. It was real. A grin spread across Izuku Midoriya's face, wide and painful and utterly triumphant. It didn't matter that his arm felt like it was on fire. It didn't matter that his ears were ringing and the shed was a disaster. All that mattered was the dent. The proof. Bakugo was wrong. All Might was wrong. A quirk didn't have to be born. It could be built. The throbbing in Izuku's arm was a dull, rhythmic ache, a constant, physical reminder of his victory. Each pulse of pain was an echo of the incredible power he had unleashed, a power he had built. He spent the morning in a daze, his mind replaying the moment of impact over and over. He disassembled the gauntlet, meticulously checking for microfractures and stress points. The primary piston housing was slightly warped, and 2 of the recoil dampeners had been completely shredded, but the core system, his ether steam converter, was perfectly intact. The design was sound. It just needed to be stronger. He needed to be stronger. He left the shed late, the scent of hot metal and ozone clinging to his clothes. His mother had insisted he get some fresh air, her worried eyes scanning the purplish bruise that was already blooming on his shoulder from the recoil. He took a longer route home from a parts supplier, his mind a whirlwind of schematics and force distribution equations. He was so lost in thought, redesigning the ARMS, in his head, that he almost missed the commotion. It began as a vibration in the cobblestones, a low, guttural rumble that was decidedly not the familiar chuff of a steam tram. Then came the screams. People were running, their faces pale with panic, their shouts snatched away by the wind. Izuku's head snapped up, his analytical mind kicking into gear even as a primal fear coiled in his stomach. He rounded a corner and saw it. Chaos. A crowd was gathered at a safe distance, held back by a line of clanking automaton constabulary. Ahead, at a major intersection where a tangle of overhead pneumatic tubes and thick steam mains converged, the source of the terror was horrifyingly clear. A sewer main, one of the city's huge, riveted iron arteries, had ruptured. But it wasn't water that had spewed forth. A geyser of thick, viscous, black sludge was pulsing from the break, a horrifying concoction of industrial runoff, rancid oil, and decades of accumulated filth. And it was alive. The thing was a writhing, amorphous mass, a mockery of a living creature. Its form constantly shifted, sucking in debris from the street, shards of broken glass, rusted bolts, and jagged pieces of scrap metal swirled within its semi-translucent body like grotesque bones in a foul jelly. It had no face, but 2 malevolent, sulphur-yellow glows pulsed deep within its core, passing for eyes. It gurgled and slurped, the sound wet and obscene, as it surged forward, leaving a slick, corrosive trail in its wake. Several pro-heroes were already on the scene. The arboreal automaton, Kamui Woods, a hero whose body was a fusion of living wood and clockwork mechanisms, had tried to ensnare the creature with his lacquered chain prison, but his wooden limbs were immediately saturated by the oily sludge, becoming heavy and slick, his gears grinding with filth. He was forced to retreat, his attacks useless. The pugilist hero, Piston Arms, renowned for his steam-powered fists, had tried a direct assault, but his punches passed through the viscous body with disgusting sucking sounds, doing no damage and only coating his expensive chrome augments in the foul substance. Then Izuku saw him. Trapped in the heart of the swirling vortex of filth was a boy with spiky ash-blonde hair. Kaken. Bakugo was being suffocated, the sludge forcing its way into his mouth and nose. But he was fighting. He was fighting with a rabid fury that was quintessentially him. Explosions ripped through the villain's body, but they did nothing to dissuade it. In fact, they made it worse. The oily sludge ignited with each blast, turning the villain into a moving conflagration that set fire to a nearby newsstand. The explosions only served to splatter the creature further, spreading its mass. Bakugo's greatest weapon, the raw, explosive power of a top-tier gifted, was utterly useless. Worse, it was a liability. "I can't get close!" Piston Arms yelled, wiping slime from his face. "The kid's explosions are too wild. And the fire, it's no good." The arboreal automaton grunted, trying to clean his joints. "My body is too vulnerable to its composition." Izuku stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, his knuckles white where he gripped the strap of his satchel. His every instinct screamed at him to run. This was a nightmare. This was a monster that the best of the best, the gifted, couldn't handle. What could he, a cogsmith with a bruised shoulder and a half-finished gauntlet back in his shed, possibly do? But he couldn't look away from Bakugo. He saw the sheer terror in his tormentor's eyes, a frantic, desperate fear that replaced the usual arrogant rage. For the first time, Izuku saw him not as Kaken, the bully, the obstacle, but as a person who was about to die. And the heroes, they were waiting. Waiting for a hero with the right quirk. Izuku's mind, a machine honed by years of relentless analysis, started to churn. Villain composition, high viscosity, semi-liquid, contains solid particulates. Flammable due to high oil content. Physical attacks are ineffective. Fire-based attacks are detrimental. Kakin is the fuel source. Need to separate the fuel from the ignition. Or, change the state of the villain itself. His eyes darted around the scene, cataloging every detail. The buildings, the infrastructure, the tools at hand. He saw the struggling heroes, the panicked crowd, the burning newsstand. Then he saw it. Bolted to the side of a brick building, painted a bright, municipal red, was a high-pressure access point. It wasn't a simple fire hydrant. The large, spoked wheel valve and the reinforced, insulated piping marked it as a direct conduit to the city's steam main, a source of immense, directed pressure, capable of delivering either scalding water or superheated steam for industrial cleaning and emergency services. An idea sparked in his brain, a wild, improbable, and incredibly dangerous schematic: high pressure and temperature. If I can apply a focused jet, could I blast the liquid mass away from Kakin? The sudden temperature change might even cause the oils to congeal, to solidify, but that valve, it's industrial grade. It would take incredible torque to open quickly. His gaze fell to his satchel. Inside, amongst his notebooks and spare parts, was a tool he'd bought earlier that day, a heavy-duty, hand-cranked winch and grapple system, designed for hauling heavy scrap. It was a simple machine, a series of gears that traded speed for power. A tool for a cogsmith. He didn't make a conscious decision. His body moved before his brain could protest. He ducked under the constabulary line, a small, unnoticed figure in the chaos. The heat from the fires washed over him, and the acrid smell of burning sludge made his eyes water. "Hey! Kid! Get back here!" A hero shouted, but Izuku was already moving. He ran, his worn boots slipping on the slick street. He skidded to a halt beside the access point, his hands already working, pulling the grappling hook from his bag. It was a heavy, three-pronged claw of forged steel, attached to a coiled cable. The winch mechanism was built into a sturdy frame with two handles. He threw the grappling hook. It sailed through the air and, with a loud clang, the claws snagged perfectly around one of the spokes of the large, red valve wheel. "What is he doing?" he heard someone yell. Izuku planted his feet, jamming the winch's frame against the brick wall for leverage. He grabbed the crank handle and began to turn. His bruised shoulder screamed in protest. The gears on the winch whined under the immense strain. His muscles burned, his teeth gritted with effort. It was like trying to turn the world itself. Useless gears, Bakugo's voice sneered in his memory. Izuku poured all his fear, his frustration, and his desperate, heroic yearning into the crank. He yelled, a raw, wordless cry of exertion. There was a deep, groaning sound from the wall, and with a sudden, bone-jarring lurch, the valve wheel turned. A sound like a dragon's roar erupted from the access point. A torrent of pressurized, near-boiling water and steam blasted out of the nozzle, aimed directly at the sludge villain. It wasn't a gentle stream, it was a focused, kinetic weapon. The effect on the villain was immediate and dramatic. The scalding jet slammed into its body, and the sludge recoiled as if struck by a solid object. The sheer force of the blast began to peel the creature's mass away from Bakugo, tearing through its form. The intense heat caused the oils and tars to hiss and bubble, parts of the villain's body hardening into a brittle, black crust. Bakugo, momentarily freed, gasped for air, his own explosion ceasing as he choked and sputtered. "It's working!" A hero yelled in astonishment. Izuku kept cranking, the winch groaning in protest, the cable pulled taut as a bowstring. He had to keep the pressure on. He had to give Bakugo a chance to get free. The villain, enraged, began to reform, its yellow eyes fixing on the small boy who was causing it so much pain. It lashed out with a thick tendril of sludge, sharp pieces of metal embedded in its tip. Izuku saw it coming, but he was trapped, his body braced against the winch. He couldn't move. He closed his eyes, bracing for the impact. He never felt it. A shadow fell over him, and the air itself seemed to compress. There was a sound like a mountain breaking in half. "I am here!" The voice was not just heard, it was felt, a seismic event that vibrated through the cobblestones and into Izuku's very bones. He opened his eyes. All Might stood between him and the villain, his colossal frame an immovable wall, a single hand held up to block the sludge tendril. He wasn't even looking at it. His famous, unwavering smile was fixed on Izuku. "You did good, young man," All Might boomed, his voice full of warmth and power. "You were clever, and you were brave. Now allow me to finish this." He turned to face the villain. The creature, sensing an existential threat, surged forward, its entire mass converging on the symbol of peace. All Might drew back his fist. Detroit. Piston punch. He didn't just hit the villain. He punched the air in front of it. The result was apocalyptic. A vortex of pure kinetic force erupted from his fist, a shockwave so powerful it created a visible distortion in the air. The wind it generated was a physical wall, a hurricane that tore through the street. It ripped the sludge villain apart on a molecular level, scattering its component parts into a fine, harmless mist. It extinguished every fire, including the one on the newsstand. It even caused the clouds above to part, allowing a brilliant shaft of sunlight to pierce the smoke-filled sky. In the aftermath, there was a stunned silence. Then, the crowd roared. Their cheers were deafening, a wave of pure adoration for their symbol. Bakugo was on his knees, gasping. The other pro-heroes looked on in awe. And in the middle of it all, Izuku Midoriya stood trembling, the handle of the winch still clutched in his hand, utterly forgotten. He had helped. He had made a difference. But as he watched All Might give a thumbs up to the cheering news crews, he felt a profound, unbridgeable chasm between them. All Might was a force of nature. Izuku was just a boy with a tool. Later, after the chaos had subsided, Izuku found himself being alternately scolded by the pro-heroes for his recklessness, and praised for his quick thinking. Bakugo, meanwhile, was being swarmed by reporters, praised for his tenacity and powerful quirk. He shot Izuku a single, venomous glare from across the street, a look that promised retribution. It was a look that said, "You didn't save me. I didn't need your help, you quirkless reject." Izuku slipped away before anyone could ask his name. He wanted no part of the accolades or the scorn. His head was spinning. He had faced a real villain, and his analysis, his engineering mind, had worked. But All Might's power, it was on another plane of existence entirely. It was the difference between a well-made clockwork bird and a living eagle. He was taking a back alley to avoid the last of the crowds when a familiar, booming voice stopped him in his tracks. "I am here, to find you." Izuku spun around. All Might, in his full, heroic glory, stood at the entrance to the alley, blocking the light. All Might! What are you?" Izuku stammered, his heart threatening to beat its way out of his chest. "Young man," the hero said, his smile softening slightly. "What you did back there, it was dangerous and foolish. You could have been killed." He took a step forward. "But you moved when no one else would. You saw a solution where others saw only a problem. You have the mind of an engineer, but the spirit of a true hero. I must know your name." Midoriya. "Izuku Midoriya," he squeaked. Suddenly, All Might began to steam. Not in a metaphorical sense. Thick, white plumes of vapor hissed from his body, as if from 1,000 hidden release valves. He staggered, clutching his side, and began to shrink. The mountain of muscle deflated like a punctured boiler, collapsing in on itself until all that remained was a skeletal man who looked more like a starved wraith than a hero. He was thin to the point of emaciation, his blonde hair hanging lank around a gaunt, hollow-cheeked face. A constant, faint trail of steam escaped from a spot on his chest, hissing quietly in the silent alley. Izuku stared, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. What? You're deflating. Are you an imposter? A clockwork decoy? The man gave a weary, wet cough. I assure you, I am All Might. He lifted his shirt, and Izuku recoiled. A horrific scar, a deep, crater-like vortex of ruined tissue, marred the left side of his torso. In the center of the scar, a small, intricate brass valve was embedded in his skin, venting a steady, quiet hiss of steam. 5 years ago, the man said, his voice now quiet and raspy, I fought a villain. He gave me this. He tapped the scar. It was a catastrophic system failure. My respiratory system was shredded, my stomach was destroyed. I've had dozens of surgeries, replaced half my organs with experimental biomechanical substitutes. This valve helps regulate my internal pressure. Without it, I'd rupture. He sighed, a sound like a dying bellows. The symbol of peace, the guy who smiles through any danger, is running on borrowed time and spare parts. I can only do hero work for about 3 hours a day now. The rest of the time, I'm this. Izuku was speechless. The number one hero, the living embodiment of power, was broken. He was a machine that was falling apart. I told you all of this to make a point, young Midoriya, All Might said, his sunken eyes fixing on Izuku's. You have a hero's heart. But the answer to the question you're about to ask is no. Izuku flinched. All Might had seen right through him. But why? Izuku whispered, the words catching in his throat. I know I don't have a quirk. I know I'm a cogsmith. But I'm smart. I can build things. I can help people. I proved it today. You did, All Might agreed, his expression pained. You proved you are a genius. But you also proved my point. You faced a mid-tier villain and nearly died. You survived because I was there. What happens when I'm not? What happens when you face a villain who can level a city block with a thought? He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone. Pro-heroes are always risking their lives. We are the wall that stands between order and chaos. I cannot, in good conscience, tell a boy with no innate defense, no inherent power, to walk that path. It would be sending you to your death. Tears streamed down Izuku's face. But my machines, my ideas, are brilliant, All Might interrupted gently. But a machine can break. It can run out of fuel. It can be disabled. A hero's power must be a part of them, an extension of their will that can't be taken away. He paused, delivering the final, crushing blow. But more importantly, young man, think about the forces involved. Think about the punch I threw. The sheer kinetic energy required to create a weather event. To match a villain of that caliber, to even survive a glancing blow from one, you would need to generate and withstand forces that would tear a normal boy's body apart from the inside. The recoil, the pressure, the G-force. Your bones would turn to powder. Your organs would rupture. It is not a question of will or intelligence. It is a question of physics. Your body would be the ultimate point of failure. Each word was a hammer blow, shattering the foundations of Izuku's dream. It wasn't a dismissal of his talent. It was worse. It was a logical, irrefutable, scientific verdict. A death sentence handed down by the laws of thermodynamics. So, no, All Might finished, his voice full of a sorrow that felt genuine. I do not think you can become a hero without a quirk. It's good to have dreams, young man. Just make sure they're realistic. With a final, pitying look, All Might turned and walked away, leaving Izuku alone on the rooftop where their conversation had migrated. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows that looked like grasping claws. The city below hissed and whirred, its million moving parts indifferent to the small, broken boy who stood above it all. His dream wasn't just dead. It had been dissected, analyzed, and proven impossible by his own personal god. Izuku Midoriya stood there, surrounded by a world of cogs and steam, and felt, for the first time, like nothing more than a broken gear in a machine he could never be a part of. The walk home from the rooftop was a funeral procession for a dream. Each step Izuku took on the hard, unforgiving cobblestones felt like a nail being hammered into a coffin that was precisely his size. The city, usually a source of endless fascination, had become a monument to his failure. The rhythmic chuffing of the steam trams sounded like a mocking laugh. The intricate dance of the clockwork towers seemed to spell out the word impossible with every ponderous tick of their great brass hands. All Might's voice was a ghost that walked beside him, its words etching themselves onto his soul with the permanence of a schematic engraved in steel. A machine can break. It can run out of fuel, tear a normal boy's body apart from the inside. He didn't remember opening the door to his apartment. He didn't remember his mother's worried questions or the way her face fell when she saw his own, utterly vacant expression. He moved like an automaton whose primary gear had been shattered, performing basic functions without thought or purpose. He ate the dinner she placed before him without tasting it. He answered her questions in monosyllables. The spark in his eyes, the one that always flared when he talked about heroes or mechanics, was gone. All that remained was a dull, gray ash. He ended up in his shed, his sanctuary, but it brought him no comfort. The room was no longer a place of hope. It was a mausoleum of his own folly. The shelves of carefully sorted components were just piles of junk. The blueprints on the wall were the scribblings of a naive child. And there, on the central workbench, sat the ARMS gauntlet. It looked pathetic. A crude, bulky piece of scrap metal. A toy. A testament to his arrogance. He had thought he could build a miracle, and all he had built was a coffin for his arm. He reached out and ran a hand over its cold, metallic surface. He could still feel the phantom ache in his shoulder, a memory of the recoil that had felt, for one glorious moment, like true power. Your bones would turn to powder. Your organs would rupture. It is not a question of will or intelligence. It is a question of physics. The finality of it was absolute. It was a truth as fundamental as gravity. You couldn't fight physics. He slumped onto his stool, the last vestiges of his strength draining out of him. He buried his face in his hands, and a single, dry sob escaped his lips. It was over. The journal, Hero Analysis for the Future, was a lie. There was no future. Not for him. Not that one. He sat there for what felt like hours as the city outside transitioned from the brassy glow of evening to the deep, gaslit indigo of night. The sounds of the world faded into a dull hum. He was adrift in a silent, gray ocean of despair. And then, a thought, quiet and insidious, surfaced from the depths. It was All Might's voice again, but this time, he heard the words differently. Not as a verdict, but as a challenge. Tear a normal boy's body apart. Izuku lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed. He looked at the gauntlet, then at his own trembling, very normal hand. The words echoed again, but now they weren't a closing statement. They were the first line of a problem statement. They were a design parameter. They were a specification for failure that he had to engineer a solution for. The despair didn't vanish. It was too vast, too heavy. But something new ignited within it, a tiny, defiant spark of his true nature. He was an analyst. He was an engineer. He was a problem solver, and this was the greatest problem he had ever faced. All Might had told him his body was the ultimate point of failure. A slow, fierce grin, the kind a cornered inventor gets just before a breakthrough, spread across Izuku's face. Then I'll just have to redesign the body. He lunged for his workbench, not at the gauntlet, but at a clean roll of blueprint paper. He unrolled it with a snap that echoed in the small shed, pinning its corners down with heavy calipers. He grabbed a piece of graphite and a T-square. His hand, which had been trembling with despair moments before, was now rock steady. His mind, which had been a fog of misery, was now crystal clear, running with the cold, beautiful logic of a machine. Problem: the human physique cannot withstand the kinetic recoil and g-forces generated by a mechanically produced, Quirk-level power output. The skeletal structure will fracture, and internal organs will suffer catastrophic damage. He wrote it at the top of the blueprint in neat block letters. Objective: design and construct a full-body system, the Advanced Response Mobilization System, ARMS, that not only generates power but also contains and mitigates these forces, effectively turning the user's entire body into a reinforced, shock-absorbent vessel. He paused, looking at the words. It was insane. It was impossible. It was the most beautiful challenge he had ever seen. He began to draw. The first sketch was not of a weapon, but of a skeleton. A second skeleton, a cage of interlocking, articulated plates and rods that would surround his own. He drew a spine made of segmented, spring-loaded steel. A rib cage of overlapping, flexible alloy bands. Then came the muscles. He sketched pneumatic actuators and bundles of coiled Myanmar wire running alongside his own limbs, designed not just to provide strength, but to brace his body against impact. The familiar, frantic scratching of his pencil filled the silence. The city outside could have its gifted, its natural-born miracles. Here, in this small, grease-stained shed, under the lonely glare of a single electric bulb, Izuku Midoriya was drafting the blueprints of his own defiance. He was going to build his miracle from the ground up, with steel and steam and sheer, bloody-minded will. The next morning, Izuku woke up slumped over his workbench, a fresh sheet of complex schematics stuck to his cheek. His neck was stiff, his eyes burned from lack of sleep, but his mind was on fire. He had the theory. He had the designs. Now he needed the materials. His collection of scavenged parts was good for prototypes, but for a full-body chassis capable of withstanding the forces he planned to generate, he needed higher-grade alloys, industrial-strength hydraulics, and components far beyond what he could find in a common scrap heap, which was why he was heading to the Dagoba Municipal Scrapyard. Dagoba wasn't just a scrap heap, it was a metallic ecosystem. Mountains of rust and obsolescence clawed at the sky, casting long, jagged shadows. The air was thick with the smell of decay, not of organic matter, but of dead technology. It smelled of corroded copper, stagnant oil, and the slow, inexorable victory of oxygen over iron. Yet, for Izuku, it was a place of endless possibility. He didn't go to the public access sorting fields. He went to the industrial sector, a sprawling, fenced-off area where the city's true mechanical titans came to die. Decommissioned factory machinery, the skeletons of old steamliners, and the gutted husks of military-grade automatons were piled here in magnificent, terrible heaps. Entry was forbidden, but the owner, a notoriously cantankerous old man, sometimes turned a blind eye to scavengers who knew what they were looking for and didn't cause trouble. As Izuku slipped through his usual gap in the fence, a voice like grinding gears cut through the air. "You again." Izuku froze. Leaning against the colossal, rust-pitted boiler was a man who seemed to be made of the scrapyard itself. He was old, with a face like a topographical map of a hard life, and a shock of wiry gray hair that defied gravity. He wore a grease-stained leather apron over a patched-up boiler suit. But the most striking thing about him was that his right sleeve was empty, pinned neatly at the shoulder. This was Kenji Tanaka, owner and sole proprietor of Dagoba Scrapyard. Rumor had it he was once a support-class hero engineer who went by the name Grease Monkey, until an accident during a villain attack had cost him his arm and his career. "Mr. Tanaka," Izuku said, bowing his head respectfully. "I was just looking." Kenji took a long drag from a cheap, hand-rolled cigarette, the tip glowing orange in the gloom of the metallic canyon. "Looking for what? Trouble?" He gestured with his cigarette at the mountains of scrap. "This ain't a playground, kid. One loose pile, and you'll end up a pancake in a tin can. Go home." "I'm not playing," Izuku said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm looking for a set of hydraulic distribution manifolds from a T-class industrial press. Preferably a Model 7 or later, and a sheet of tungsten carbide alloy, at least a quarter-inch thick." Kenji paused, the cigarette halfway to his lips. He squinted at Izuku, his one good eye sharp and appraising. That wasn't the request of a casual scavenger looking for copper wire to sell. It was the specific, educated request of an engineer with a project. "What's a pipsqueak like you need with military-grade press hydraulics?" Kenji grunted, smoke curling from his nostrils. "Building a death ray to get even with a school bully?" Izuku flushed. "No. It's for a support frame. For force distribution." "Force distribution," Kenji repeated, his tone flat and unconvinced. He took a step forward, his gaze sweeping over Izuku's thin frame. "You look like a strong wind could snap you in half. What kind of forces are you planning on distributing?" The question was a test. A casual lie wouldn't work. Izuku took a breath and decided on a partial, technical truth. Recoil forces. From a high-pressure, steam piston system. The initial design failed to account for the physical toll on the operator. Kenji's eyebrow twitched. He was silent for a long moment, studying the boy. He saw the grease under his fingernails, the fierce intelligence in his green eyes, and the faint, almost invisible shimmer of obsession that clung to him like an aura. He'd seen that look before, in the mirror, many years ago. "The frame won't be enough," Kenji said abruptly. Izuku blinked. "What?" "The frame," Kenji repeated, gesturing with his head towards Izuku's blueprints, which were peeking out of his satchel. "You're thinking of a rigid cage, right? To brace the bones. You're thinking like a mechanic building a chassis. But you're putting a soft, squishy human inside. You hit something, the frame might hold, but your organs are still gonna turn to jelly. It's called inertia, kid. Look it up." He flicked his cigarette butt away, where it landed with a hiss on a damp patch of ground. Tungsten carbide is over by the east wall, behind the pile of dead constabulary bots. Manifolds are in the G7 sector. Try not to get yourself killed. And the price is double for trespassers. He turned and walked away without another word, disappearing behind a mountain of rusted gears. Izuku stood there stunned. Kenji hadn't just given him permission, he'd given him advice. And he was right. Izuku had been so focused on the skeletal system that he neglected the soft tissue. The problem was more complex than he'd imagined. He felt a surge of exhilaration. This was why he came here. This was a place where knowledge was a currency, and problems were the air you breathed. With a newfound sense of purpose, he scrambled off toward the G7 sector, Kenji's gruff words echoing in his mind, already sparking new, more complex designs. The shed became a crucible. The days blurred into a cycle of school, scavenging at Dagoba, and long nights of furious, painstaking work. His allowance, saved up for months, vanished in a cascade of payments to Kenji for high-grade materials. His room became a library, anatomical charts and medical textbooks on trauma physics spread out next to advanced engineering manuals. He wasn't just building a suit of armor. He was building a second body, one that could withstand a war. He followed Kenji's advice, turning the problem of inertia over and over in his mind. The solution, when it came, was multi-layered. First came the inner lining. He managed to acquire a decommissioned pilot's G-force compression suit. He carefully stripped it down, reinforcing it with a custom-woven mesh of shock-absorbent polymer fibers. This was the first line of defense, designed to keep his blood from pooling and his organs from shifting under extreme acceleration. Next came the gel layer. He spent a week experimenting with non-Newtonian fluids, creating a shear thickening liquid that he sealed into a series of interconnected bladders. This layer would lie between the compression suit and the mechanical chassis. Under normal movement, it was pliable. Upon sudden impact, it would instantly become rigid, distributing the force of a blow across the entire surface of his body. It was messy, difficult work, and more than one bladder ruptured during testing, covering him and half the shed in sticky, foul-smelling goo. Then came the mechanical chassis itself, his second skeleton. He built it piece by piece, starting with the torso. The segmented spine was a marvel of microengineering, each vertebra a steel disc separated by a stack of Belvo washers and a miniature hydraulic dampener. The rib cage was a lattice of the flexible, high-tensile alloy Kenji had pointed him towards, allowing for movement, while providing immense protection. This iterative process of design and failure became the rhythm of his life. The first test of the piston leap boots was a near disaster. He constructed a pair of reinforced greaves and boots, each housing a powerful, rapid-venting steam piston. He calibrated the output to what he calculated was a safe 15%. Standing in the middle of the scrapyard's G7 sector, a wide, flat expanse of crushed metal, he took a deep breath and activated them. The upward thrust was incredible. He shot into the air a full 30 feet, a shocked laugh escaping his lips. For a glorious second, he was flying. Then gravity reasserted itself. He came down hard, his legs locking instinctively to absorb the impact. It was a mistake. The force of the landing, unmitigated, traveled up his legs like a shockwave. A searing, white-hot pain shot through his right tibia. He collapsed with a cry, his vision blacking out for a moment. He was lucky. He'd only suffered a severe bone bruise and a sprained ankle, but the lesson was seared into his brain. All Might's warning wasn't just about the recoil from his own attacks. It was about every force the world could throw at him. Landing was just as dangerous as punching. He spent the next 2 weeks on his back, his leg elevated, furiously redesigning the boots. He integrated a system of powerful shock absorbers into the heels, salvaged from the landing gear of a scrapped cargo drone. He added secondary, low-pressure steam vents to the soles, designed to fire just before impact to cushion his landings. His mother watched his obsessive work with a growing sense of terror. She saw the new burns that peppered his arms from steam pipe leaks, the dark, bruised circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, the way he limped on his sprained ankle but refused to rest. One evening, she found him slumped on his stool, asleep at his workbench, his head resting on a half-finished gauntlet. A small, high-pressure steam line near the power core was hissing, a tiny, almost invisible jet of scalding vapor shooting into the air. If he had shifted in his sleep, it could have cut across his face, blinding him. Inko's heart stopped. With shaking hands, she used a pair of insulated tongs to shut off the main valve to his ether steam converter. The hissing stopped. She stood there, looking at her brilliant, reckless, wonderful boy, and felt a wave of helpless fear. "Izuku," she whispered, gently shaking him awake. He woke with a start, blinking in confusion. "Mom? What is it? Did I finish the pressure calibration for the Mark II gauntlet?" "Izuku, we need to talk," she said, her voice strained. This has to stop." "Stop?" he asked, suddenly wide awake. "I can't stop. I'm getting closer. The shock absorption system is finally working, and I've almost finished the primary chassis." "I found this in your room," she interrupted, holding up a medical textbook. It was open to a chapter on high-velocity impact trauma, filled with gruesome diagrams of internal injuries. Her hand was trembling. "I see the burns. I see the bruises. I hear the explosions from this shed in the middle of the night. You're going to kill yourself." Tears streamed down her face. "I know your dream is important. But you are more important. Please, Izuku. You're not like All Might. You don't have a quirk to protect you. You're just a boy." Izuku looked at his mother's terrified face, and the weight of her love and fear was a heavier blow than any physical impact he had endured. He wanted to promise her he'd stop. He wanted to throw all his blueprints and tools into a furnace and be the safe, normal son she deserved. But he couldn't. The dream was too deeply woven into the fiber of his being. To give it up now would be a different kind of death. "I know I'm not like him, Mom," he said softly, his own voice thick with emotion. "That's why I have to do this. The gifted, they're born strong. They don't have to think about it. I have to think about everything. Every single piece of this," he swept a hand around the workshop, "is a piece of a puzzle. How to be strong. How to be safe. How to be a hero. I'm not just being reckless. Every burn, every bruise, it's a lesson. It's me learning how to be safe. I promise. I am being careful." He took the book from her hand and closed it. "All Might told me my body was the weak point. So I'm making it strong. Not with a quirk, but with this. With my mind. Please, Mom. Believe in me." She looked into his eyes, and what she saw there wasn't just obsession. It was a deep, unwavering conviction. It was the same look his father had when he was on the verge of a breakthrough. She didn't understand the mechanics, but she understood the fire. With a choked sob, she pulled him into a hug, burying her face in his shoulder. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice muffled by his shirt. "Please, just be careful." "I will," he promised, hugging her back tightly. "I promise." The conversation didn't stop her from worrying, but it marked a subtle shift. The next day, she left a basket by the shed door containing not just his dinner, but also a set of high-grade, insulated mechanics gloves and a jar of professional-grade burn salve. It was her way of saying, "If I can't stop you, I will do everything I can to help you survive this." His work continued with a renewed, feverish intensity. He finished the legs, the torso, the arms. Each piece was a self-contained marvel of engineering, a fusion of hydraulics, pneumatics, and shock-absorbent materials. He brought the finished chassis components to the scrapyard to show Kenji, hoping for a nod of approval. Kenji circled the gleaming steel skeleton laid out on a tarp, his one eye missing nothing. He prodded a joint with the toe of his boot. He tapped the chest plate. He ran a callous finger over the intricate network of cooling tubes Izuku had integrated into the back plate. "It's a coffin," Kenji said bluntly. Izuku's heart sank. "What?" "But I did everything you said. It has a gel layer, a compression suit, multi-stage dampeners. It's a beautiful coffin," Kenji corrected, a flicker of something like respect in his eye. "You've built a machine to survive an impact. But that's not what a hero does. A hero moves. A hero fights. This thing," he gestured at the suit, "is too rigid. Too heavy. The weight distribution is all in the limbs. You try to throw a punch, you'll throw yourself off balance. You try to dodge, you'll trip over your own feet. You've built a bunker. You need to build a battlesuit. He was right. Again. In his focus on survival, Izuku had sacrificed mobility. You're thinking in components, Kenji continued, squatting down to point at the hip joint. Arm, leg, torso. You need to think in systems. How does the arm work with the back? How does the leg transfer power through the hip into the spine? It's not just a second skeleton. It has to be a second set of muscles, too. It has to move with you, not for you. He stood up and grunted. Look at the high-end constabulary bots. The pursuit models. Not the clankers they use for patrol. Look at how their joints are designed. Not simple hinges. Ball joints, universal joints, nested rotational actuators. It's all about fluidity. Integration. It was the final piece of the puzzle. The philosophical breakthrough. Izuku spent the next week doing exactly that, sneaking into the constabulary impound lot that bordered the scrapyard, sketching the designs of wrecked pursuit drones. He returned to his workshop and began the painstaking process of rebuilding every single joint on the ARMS. He replaced simple hydraulic pistons with bundles of myomer wire that contracted like real muscle. He redesigned the joints to mimic the human body's own range of motion, adding rotational servos for fluidity. The suit began to transform. It was no longer just a shell. It was becoming a true extension of his own body. Finally, after months of ceaseless labor, it was ready. The ARMS Mark I. He stood before it in the quiet of his shed. It was not the sleek, polished armor of the heroes in the comics. It was a hulking, utilitarian machine of scarred steel, exposed brass piping, and tightly wound cables. Steam vents dotted its shoulders and back, and the ether steam core glowed with a soft, blue light from within the reinforced chest cavity. It looked heavy. It looked dangerous. It looked like it was born in a scrapyard. He was exhausted. His body was a roadmap of his failures, a network of faded burns, faint scars, and the lingering ache of bruises. His savings were gone. He had pushed himself to the very edge of his physical and mental limits. But as he looked at the machine before him, he felt a sense of profound accomplishment that eclipsed all the pain. He had faced an impossible problem, a verdict handed down by the symbol of peace himself, and he had solved it. Not with a miracle. Not with a gift. But with sweat, with intellect, and with countless, painful failures. He reached out and placed a hand on the cool metal of the chest plate. This was more than a machine. It was a statement. It was his answer to a world that had told him he was worthless. It was the physical manifestation of his refusal to be broken. He hadn't just built a suit. He had forged a quirk. And now, it was time to see what it could do. The ARMS Mark I stood complete in the center of the shed, a monument to sleepless nights and scarred hands. It was a hulking, magnificent beast of steel and brass, and it was utterly, terrifyingly dead. Every piston was seated, every joint articulated, every wire connected. Yet, when Izuku attempted to power it on, the result was less a triumphant awakening and more a mechanical death rattle. He stood behind a hastily erected shield of reinforced boilerplate, a thick bundle of ignition cables in his hand. Primary ether steam core ignition, now! He muttered, his voice tight with a mixture of terror and excitement. He slammed the master switch down. For a single, beautiful second, it worked. The ether tube in the chest plate flared with a brilliant, sapphire light. A deep, resonant hum filled the shed, the sound of immense power waiting to be unleashed. The pressure gauges on his remote monitoring station began to climb, steady and true. 50%. 60%. 70%. Then came the shudder. It started as a low vibration, a discordant note in the symphony of power. The blue light flickered, turning a sickly violet at the edges. The hum became a grating, high-pitched screech, the sound of metal being tortured. No, no, no! Izuku whispered, his eyes wide, his knuckles white on the console. Pressure is fluctuating. Asymmetrical etheric resonance. It's creating a feedback loop. The gauges went wild, their needles thrashing back and forth like trapped birds. The entire ARMS chassis began to shake violently, its heavy boots skittering on the concrete floor. A horrifying groaning sound emanated from the chest plate, and the ether core pulsed erratically, spitting miniature bolts of static electricity that sizzled against the inside of its containment glass. "Emergency shutdown!" Izuku yelled to himself, fumbling with the safety switch. He slammed it down, and with a deafening clang and a violent hiss of venting steam, the system died. The blue light vanished. The screeching stopped. The suit stood silent once more, a faint wisp of ozone-scented smoke curling from its chest. Izuku sagged against his control panel, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt a cold, slick dread creep up his spine. This was the third time this week. He had built the perfect body, a mechanical marvel of shock absorption and reinforced strength. But the heart of the machine, his homemade ether steam converter, was a wild, untamable beast. He designed it himself, based on theoretical physics and scavenged parts. It worked in principle. But it was inefficient, unstable, and dangerously unpredictable. The power it generated wasn't a smooth, steady flow. It was a series of uncontrolled, spastic bursts. It was like trying to power a complex clockwork watch with a series of gunpowder explosions. The ARMS could withstand the force, but it couldn't operate with such a chaotic power source. He spent the next hour running diagnostics, his initial fear replaced by a familiar, gnawing frustration. The data confirmed his suspicions. His energy converter was the problem, but the root of that problem was a single, tiny component he simply couldn't fabricate or afford: a high-grade, intelligent regulator valve. He needed something that could react in microseconds to the ether's chaotic energy fluctuations, smoothing them out into a usable current of pressurized steam. The salvage pneumatic valves he was using were too slow, too crude. They were like trying to conduct a symphony with a sledgehammer. He slumped onto his stool, running a greasy hand through his already wild hair. He had hit a wall. It wasn't a wall of physics or engineering theory, but a cold, hard wall of economics. The kind of regulator he needed wasn't something you found lying around. It was military grade, or used in the private labs of top-tier support companies. It was a piece of tech that might as well be on the moon. Without it, the ARMS was nothing more than the world's most complex and dangerous garden sculpture. The dream that he had so painstakingly rebuilt was dying on his workbench, not from a catastrophic failure, but from the lack of one single, perfect part. There was only one place to go. One last, desperate hope. He needed a miracle, and miracles, in his world, were sometimes found buried under mountains of junk. The next day, Izuku was back at the Dagoba Municipal Scrapyard, but his search was different. He wasn't looking for bulk materials or common components. He was on a treasure hunt, a needle in a haystack quest. He moved with a grim determination, his eyes scanning every pile, every busted machine, looking for the telltale signs of high-end, precision engineering. He'd been at it for hours, sifting through the remains of a decommissioned power plant, when he heard it. A high-pitched, manic whirring sound, like a swarm of angry, metallic hornets. It was followed by a series of loud clangs and a cheerful, "Hoopsie." A little too much torque on that baby. Izuku crept cautiously around a mountain of corroded ductwork. In a small clearing, a freshly dumped pile of scrap glittered under the afternoon sun. It wasn't the usual industrial refuse. This was high-end stuff: the shattered chassis of a hero-grade pursuit drone, the innards of a corporate data server, and the gleaming, chrome-plated arm of what looked like a medical automaton. It was a gourmet meal for an inventor, and feasting upon it was a girl. She had a wild mane of pink hair, twisted into thick dreadlocks that seemed to have a life of their own. A pair of enormous, multi-lens goggles were perched on her forehead, and her face was smudged with grease in a way that looked almost deliberate, like war paint. She was using a pneumatic wrench that was almost too big for her to handle, attacking a sealed component on the drone's chassis with a terrifying, gleeful abandon. "Come on, baby, open up for mama," she chirped, bracing herself and giving the wrench another powerful blast. With a final, agonized screech of metal, the panel popped open. Aha! Success! Izuku watched, frozen. He'd seen other scavengers before, but they were usually grim-faced men looking for copper to weigh in. This girl had the same feverish intensity he felt in his own workshop. She spotted him. Her head snapped up, and the zoom lenses on her goggles clicked into focus with an audible whir. "Hey! You!" she called out, her voice bright and loud. This is my pile. I called dibs. You can't call dibs on a whole pile, Izuku countered, finding his voice. And I was here first. Possession is 9/10 of the law, green bean. She shot back, patting the drone chassis possessively. And my babies and I are already happily acquainted. Now, unless you've got a tri-wing sonic screwdriver and a schematic for a tachyon particle separator, I suggest you go play with the discarded toasters. Izuku's eyes widened. A tachyon particle separator? That's purely theoretical. The temporal displacement paradox alone makes it unfeasible with current etheric conversion technology. The girl's manic grin widened. She vaulted over the drone chassis and marched right up to him, getting so close he could smell the lubricant on her clothes. Aha! A fellow enthusiast. You're wrong, though. The paradox can be bypassed if you create a stabilized, non-Euclidean containment field. It's my long-term project. She stuck out a gloved hand. May Hatsum, inventor extraordinaire, and future CEO of Hatsum Industries. My babies will change the world. Izuku Midoriya, he stammered, shaking her hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Midoriya, she said, her eyes, magnified by her goggles, scanning him from head to toe. You look like a tinkerer. What's your poison? Cryodynamics? Pneumatics? Robotics? Ether steam mechanics and support gear integration, he said. Ooh, a classicist. I like it. She gestured back to the pile. Well, classicist, this is the motherlode. They decommissioned a private hero support lab. This stuff is gold. I'm looking for a gyroscopic stabilizer for my new jet-propelled roller skates. Izuku's eyes lit up, his own mission momentarily forgotten. Jet-propelled roller skates. What's your fuel source? Pressurized gas is too unstable for personal transport, and a steam boiler would be too heavy. See? You get it! May exclaimed, her energy infectious. That's the fun. Solving the unsolvable. But I need that stabilizer. So, what's your prize, green bean? What rare and beautiful baby are you hoping to find in this glorious heap? Izuku's focus snapped back. A regulator. A high-sensitivity, rapid-response pressure regulator valve. May's grin vanished, replaced by a look of avaricious hunger. The Holy Grail, she breathed. A smart valve. Oh yeah? You find one of those, you can do anything. Stabilize a plasma conduit, fine-tune a hydraulic press to a nanometer of tolerance, or make a truly perfect cup of tea with a steam-powered kettle. She pointed a finger at his chest. If there's a valve like that in this pile, it's mine. My jet skates take priority. My project is more important. Izuku argued, a competitive fire he rarely felt starting to burn. It's a full-body mobility and response frame. It needs the stability. A frame is boring. My skates will revolutionize urban transport, she declared, and so began the great salvage race. For the next hour, they worked on opposite sides of the pile, a strange mixture of rivals and colleagues. They dug through the scrap with frantic energy, their conversation a rapid-fire exchange of technical jargon, half-finished ideas, and good-natured insults. Is that a biphasic power conduit? What are you gonna do with that? It's obsolete. May would yell. I can retrofit it to handle a steam-based coolant system. Much more efficient than your air-cooled nonsense. Izuku would shout back, pulling a tangle of wires free. It was exhilarating. For the first time, Izuku had met someone who spoke his language, who understood the sacred beauty of a perfectly machined gear or a well-designed circuit board. Even as they competed, a strange sense of camaraderie began to form. He was digging near the bottom of the pile, clearing away a sheet of bent plasteel, when his shovel struck something that didn't sound like normal scrap. It wasn't the dull thud of iron or the high-pitched ting of aluminum. It was a deep, resonant, and oddly musical thrum. Intrigued, he cleared away the surrounding debris. What he uncovered was not a machine part. It was a piece of armor, a bracer, to be precise, though it was massive, clearly designed for an arm far larger than his own. It was made of a strange, cobalt blue alloy he didn't recognize, scarred and pitted from what must have been a tremendous battle. Faded streaks of red and white paint were still visible, a familiar, iconic color scheme that made his breath catch in his throat. "Whoa, shiny," May said, peering over his shoulder, her rivalry forgotten in the face of a new discovery. "What is that, baby?" "The alloy is incredible. Some kind of self-repairing polymer bonded to a titanium lattice?" Izuku didn't answer. He ran his trembling fingers over the scarred surface. He knew what this was. He had seen it in grainy, archive footage from a decade ago. It was a piece of one of All Might's earliest support costumes, from before his fighting style had become so refined that he barely needed armor at all. This was a relic. A piece of history. A piece of his god. He carefully lifted it. It was incredibly heavy. As he turned it over, a section of the damaged interior plating fell away, revealing the intricate machinery within. And there, nestled amongst a web of power conduits and synthetic muscle fibers, was a small, cylindrical object made of gleaming, polished brass and crystal. It was no bigger than his thumb, covered in calibration marks so fine he could barely see them. A single, insulated pipe ran into it, and a dozen microtubules ran out. He knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in his soul, what he was looking at. It was a regulator valve. But it was unlike any he had ever seen. It seemed to hum with a faint, contained energy, and a soft, internal light pulsed within the crystal housing, a steady, rhythmic beat like a tiny, mechanical heart. "Whoa," May breathed, her goggles zooming in so close her nose was almost touching it. "Is that a quantum state etheric regulator? I've only seen these in textbooks. They say it uses a contained singularity to moderate energy flow. That's not just military-grade Midoriya, that's practically magic. One of my babies would kill for a part like that." Izuku clutched the bracer to his chest, his heart pounding. This was it. This was the miracle. A part forged for the symbol of peace himself. But the sheer complexity of it was terrifying. Integrating this into his own crude, homemade system would be like trying to install the engine of a starship into a go-kart. One wrong connection, and the resulting energy overload wouldn't just destroy his workshop. It would probably vaporize half the city block. He couldn't do this alone. He needed help. He needed a master. Kenji Tanaka was in his workshop, a large, corrugated iron shed that was somehow even more cluttered than Izuku's, attempting to repair a vintage gramophone with his one good hand and a series of clever, foot-operated clamps. He didn't look up when Izuku entered, carrying the All Might bracer like a holy relic. "Whatever you broke, you're paying for it," Kenji grunted, using a pair of tweezers to place a tiny screw. "I didn't break anything, Mr. Tanaka," Izuku said, his voice hushed with reverence. "I found something." He placed the heavy bracer on a clear spot on the workbench. Kenji finished with his screw, then glanced over at it. His usual look of cantankerous indifference vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp stillness. He put down his tools and walked over, his one eye scrutinizing the piece of armor. He ran his callous fingers over the scarred blue metal, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. "The Golden Age model," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Haven't seen one of these up close in 20 years. Back when he was still breaking his own arms with every other punch." He tapped the armor. This was David Shield's early work. Mad genius. Always trying to build a machine that could keep up with a god. His eye then fell on the exposed regulator valve nestled inside. He leaned in closer, his breath fogging the polished brass. "And this," he whispered, a note of awe in his gravelly voice, "was his masterpiece. An unstable work of genius, just like him." He looked at Izuku, his gaze sharp and serious. "Where did you find this?" "In a new scrap pile. From a hero support lab," Izuku explained. "Figures. They decommissioned most of this line after it nearly overloaded and took All Might's arm off during the toxic chainsaw incident," Kenji said. He straightened up, crossing his one arm over his chest. "What do you want with it, kid?" "I need to use it," Izuku said, his voice shaking slightly but full of conviction. "The regulator. I need it for my project. For the ARMS core." Kenji was silent for a full minute. He looked from the impossibly advanced piece of technology to the determined, terrified boy standing before him. He saw the same dangerous fire in Izuku's eyes that he had seen in David Shield's, and that he remembered seeing in his own. "You have any idea what you're asking?" Kenji said, his voice dangerously quiet. This isn't a simple valve. It doesn't just regulate pressure. It learns. It adapts to the energy signature of its user. It was designed to work in tandem with the most powerful quirk on the planet. You hook your cobbled-together boiler up to this thing, and one of two things will happen. Either it won't work at all, or it will try to draw an infinite amount of ether from the atmosphere and detonate with the force of an artillery shell. Izuku swallowed hard, but he didn't back down. That's why I came to you. I can't do it alone. You know this tech. You were a pro, weren't you? Grease monkey. My dad had a trading card of you. He said you were the best support engineer of your generation. Kenji flinched as if struck. He turned away, his gaze falling on his empty sleeve. That was a long time ago, he said bitterly. A lifetime ago. Please, Izuku pressed, his voice cracking with desperation. You told me to think in systems. This is the heart of my system. Without it, everything I've built is just scrap. You're the only one who can help me perform the transplant. Kenji stood with his back to Izuku, staring at a faded photograph pinned to the wall, a picture of a younger, two-armed Kenji standing proudly next to a smiling, fresh-faced All Might. He was silent for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he sighed, a deep, weary sound, like a rusty hinge giving way. Get it on the bench, he grunted, not turning around. And bring me my micro-calibration kit. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. And if you so much as sneeze while you're soldering, I'll use that fancy suit of yours to patch the hole in my roof. A grin of pure, unadulterated relief split Izuku's face. The next 6 hours were the most intense, grueling, and wonderful of Izuku's life. It was a master class in engineering, taught by a reluctant, one-armed master. Kenji didn't do the work for him. He directed, he corrected, he explained. His voice was a constant, gruff presence over Izuku's shoulder. Not that conduit, you idiot! That's the coolant return. You'll flood it. Use the insulated line. Easy with the plasma cutter. You're not chopping wood. Recalibrate the primary sensor. You have to trick it into thinking your ether core's energy signature is a biological quirk. Sync its output frequency to your own heartbeat. Give it a pulse. Izuku worked with a focus he had never known. His hands, usually so steady, trembled with a mixture of awe and terror as he carefully, surgically extracted the legendary regulator from its housing. Under Kenji's watchful eye, he fabricated a new, lead-lined containment housing for it and began the terrifying process of integrating it into the ARMS chest plate. It was like performing open-heart surgery on a sleeping demigod. Finally, as the moon rose high over the scrapyard, it was done. The new heart was in place. The small, cylindrical valve sat in the center of the ARMS core, its internal light dormant. Every connection had been checked and double-checked. All right, kid, Kenji said, wiping his hand on an oil rag. Moment of truth. Power it on. And stand behind the blast shield. Izuku's heart was in his throat. He retreated behind the thick shield, holding the ignition cables. He looked over at Kenji, who gave him a single, curt nod. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Izuku slammed the switch. There was no screeching this time. No violent shudder. There was only a hum. It started soft, a low, pure tone that resonated in the air. The regulator valve came to life, its internal light pulsing with a steady, soft, blue-white glow, a perfect, rhythmic beat. The ether in the main containment tube did not flicker or spit. It began to swirl, forming a stable, miniature vortex of pure energy, a tiny, captured star. The pressure gauges on the monitoring station climbed smoothly, without a single tremor, and stopped precisely at 100%, the needles perfectly still. The ARMS mark I was alive. It radiated a quiet, steady power that Izuku could feel in his bones. It was a deep, thrumming well of energy, stable, contained, and waiting. He looked at the steady gauges, at the beautiful, stable light in the suit's chest, and then at Kenji. The old man was staring at the machine, a look on his face that was no longer bitter or cantankerous. It was a look of profound, weary pride. The heart of a hero, Kenji said, his voice barely a whisper. That's what Shield called that valve. Said it was the only thing he ever built that could keep up with All Might's spirit. He turned his gaze to Izuku, and his one good eye was sharp and piercing. "You've got the heart of a hero in that machine now, kid," he said, his voice returning to its normal gruffness. "Don't disappoint it." The week following the successful heart transplant was a blur of final adjustments and meticulous, nerve-wracking preparations. The ARMS Mark I no longer felt like a collection of parts. It had a presence, a soul. It sat dormant in the center of the shed, its new heart pulsing with a faint, sleepy, blue-white light, like a hibernating beast. Izuku found himself talking to it, whispering encouragements as he tightened the last bolts and polished the scarred, unpainted steel of its chassis. He was no longer just its creator, he was its partner. Kenji had insisted on a full diagnostic cycle, a series of low-power system checks to ensure the new regulator had properly synced with Izuku's crude, homemade systems. The old engineer had been a constant, gruff presence, either in person or via terse, demanding messages sent through the city's pneumatic tube network. "Did you reinforce the coolant lines? The quantum regulator runs hotter than a standard model. Don't melt your own chest plate, kid. Or recalibrate the leg actuators. The power flow is smoother now. Your old settings will send you into orbit." Izuku complied with every instruction. He was a novice standing in the shadow of a master, and he knew it. He spent 2 days just rewriting the control software, learning to interface with a piece of technology so advanced it felt almost precognitive. The valve didn't just regulate power, it anticipated his needs. When he ran a simulation of a punch, the regulator would begin shunting power to the arm actuators before the command was even fully executed, resulting in a theoretical response time that was faster than his own nervous system. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Finally, the day came. All diagnostics were green. All systems were nominal. Kenji had given his reluctant, grunted approval. It was time for a full-power, full-body test run. His shed was too small. His backyard was too small. The entire residential district was too small. He needed space. He needed a place where the collateral damage of his inevitable failures wouldn't bring the automaton constabulary down on him. There was only one such place, Sector Gamma. It was a blight on the city's otherwise gleaming brass facade, a quarantined and forgotten industrial zone on the very edge of Muzurifu. Decades ago, it had been the heart of the city's chemical processing and manufacturing industry. But a catastrophic industrial accident, a massive, uncontrolled etheric detonation at a power plant, had rendered the entire area unstable and hazardous. The buildings were crumbling concrete skeletons, choked with rust and strange, crystalline growths from the etheric fallout. The air tasted of metal and regret. It was the perfect mechanical playground. He transported the ARMS in pieces, using a heavy-duty, hand-pulled cart he'd built, making several trips under the cover of the pre-dawn gloom. The final trip was the heaviest, carrying the torso and the precious, newly integrated core. As he pulled the cart through the rusted, broken gates of Sector Gamma, the rising sun cast long, skeletal shadows from the ruined factories. The silence was absolute, broken only by the creak of his cart's wheels and the distant cry of a rust hawk. He chose a wide, open plaza, a cracked and weed-choked expanse of ferroconcrete that had once been the loading bay for a massive factory. Here, surrounded by the ghosts of industry, he began the methodical, ritualistic process of suiting up for the very first time. It was not a quick or elegant procedure. This was not the sleek, form-fitting armor of comic books. It was a complex, multi-layered system, and each piece had to be donned in a precise sequence. First came the inner layer, the reinforced compression suit, tight and constricting, its fine mesh of polymer fibers cool against his skin. Next, he carefully strapped on the gel-filled bladder system, which felt like wearing a suit of heavy, waterlogged leather. Then, piece by piece, he began to lock the heavy, steel chassis of the ARMS around himself. The greaves and piston-lead boots clamped around his legs with a series of satisfying, solid clicks. The thigh plates, housing the myomer bundle muscles, were next. Then came the most difficult part, the torso. He had to use a small, hand-cranked crane he brought with him to lift the heavy chest and back plate assembly over his head. He wriggled into it, and the sheer weight, over 200 pounds of steel, brass, and machinery, settled onto his shoulders, making his knees buckle. He quickly sealed the front clasps, and the weight distributed more evenly across the frame's internal harness. The articulated arms were next, locking into the shoulder mounts. Finally, he slid his hands into the heavy gauntlets, feeling the familiar controls of the internal grips. The last piece was the helmet. It was a heavy, enclosed affair, with a reinforced plasteel visor and a series of external sensors. He settled it over his head, and the world outside was replaced by the cool, green glow of the heads-up display. With a final, resonant clank, he sealed the neck ring. He was in. The world was gone. There was only the hum of the internal life support, the smell of filtered air, and the flood of data scrolling across his visor. ARMS Mark I online, biosync stable, ether steam core dormant, internal pressure nominal, operator vitals, heart rate 145 BPM, elevated. He couldn't help but grin. Elevated? Try skyrocketing. He took a slow, calming breath, the sound amplified in the confines of the helmet. He was sealed inside a walking engine of destruction of his own design. It was the most terrifying and wonderful feeling in the world. "Okay, Deku," he whispered, his voice tinny through the helmet's internal comms. "System activation." On my mark, he reached for the master ignition switch located on the inside of his right gauntlet. His gloved finger hovered over it. This was the moment of truth. All the theory, all the pain, all the failures and small victories had led to this. He pressed the switch. The sensation was indescribable. It was not like the violent, screeching jolt of the old core. This was a smooth, inexorable wave of power that washed over him. He felt a deep, resonant THRRUMMM that vibrated not just through the suit, but through his very bones. The etheric heart came to life, its steady, rhythmic pulse now his own. The HUD flared with light as every system came online. The suit, which had been a dead weight on his shoulders, suddenly felt alive. Weightless, the pneumatic and myomer systems engaged, perfectly counterbalancing the chassis, making it feel less like armor and more like a second skin. Core online 100%, all systems green. "Welcome, operator." "Whoa," he breathed. He took a tentative step. The leg moved with him, perfectly mimicking his motion, the heavy footfall landing with a solid, satisfying crunch on the broken concrete. He took another step, then another. He was walking. He was walking in a machine that weighed more than he did, as easily as if he were wearing a simple coat. Kenji had been right. It wasn't about components. It was about integration. He looked at his gauntlet hand and slowly balled it into a fist. The metal plates shifted silently, smoothly. The power thrumming through the arm was immense, a caged beast waiting for his command. On his left forearm was a large, robust dial, a custom-built potentiometer that he had salvaged from an old power station. It was his control throttle, his interface with the etheric heart. The dial was marked from 0 to 100. Kenji had warned him, in no uncertain terms, that going above 30% on the first run would be suicidal. His body, even protected by the suit, was not accustomed to these forces. He carefully, deliberately, turned the dial. Output set 5%. A new, higher-pitched hum joined the core's steady thrum. He could feel the increased power flowing into the limbs, a low-level static of pure potential. He looked at a nearby pile of rubble, a collection of broken cinder blocks. He drew back his right arm, mimicking the motion of his first, fateful test with the prototype gauntlet. He threw the punch. His arm shot forward with incredible speed. The impact was a sharp, cracking sound. The cinder block he'd aimed for didn't just break, it disintegrated into a cloud of gray dust. And the recoil, there was none. Or rather, he felt it, but it wasn't a sharp, painful jolt. It was a dull, satisfying push, perfectly distributed across the torso and absorbed by the back-mounted dampeners. The suit had done its job. A wild, exultant laugh escaped his lips. It works. It actually works. Emboldened, he began to experiment. He spent the next hour like a child with a new toy, a very large, very dangerous, city block leveling toy. He tested his strength, cautiously increasing the power output. At 10%, he could punch through a rusting steel girder. At 15%, he tore the heavy iron door off a ruined warehouse and crumpled it into a ball. With every action, he felt his confidence grow. The suit was an extension of his will, translating his thoughts into overwhelming force, but strength was only one part of the equation. A hero needed to be mobile. He looked at his heavy, piston-driven boots. It was time to test the piston leap system. He remembered the searing pain of his last, uncontrolled landing. This time, he had his new shock absorbers and the cushioning steam vents. He hoped they would be enough. He set the power output dial back down to a conservative 10%. He crouched, feeding power to the leg pistons, the pneumatic actuators hissing as they charged. Piston leap system, charged. Okay, he muttered. Just a small hop. A bunny hop. He triggered the release. The upward thrust was not a bunny hop. It was a cannon launch. He shot into the air with a roar of escaping steam, the ground shrinking beneath him with terrifying speed. He hadn't accounted for the new core's hyper-efficiency. 10% on the new heart was more like 40% on the old one. Too high. Too high. He yelled into the empty air, pinwheeling his arms uselessly. He soared in a clumsy arc, reaching an apex of nearly 100 feet before gravity, inevitable and unforgiving, took hold. He plummeted. Panic seized him. The ground rushed up to meet him, a patchwork of gray and green. All Might's words about his organs turning to jelly screamed in his mind. He was going to be a crater. He was going to die in his triumphant moment. Think. Kenji's voice barked in his memory. Don't just fight with it. Think with it. He fought back the panic, his analytical mind kicking into gear. Landing thrusters. His HUD was a blur of red warning lights and altitude readings. He had to time it perfectly. Too soon, and he'd just slow his descent before running out of steam. Too late, and it wouldn't matter. His thumb found the control stud on his gauntlet. He watched the altitude numbers spool down. 50 feet. 40, 30. Every good engineer knows how to fix things on the fly. 20 feet. Now, he slammed the button. A massive, sustained blast of steam erupted from the soles of his boots. The force was tremendous, a counter-thrust that slammed him upwards, arresting his fall with a bone-jarring jolt. His descent slowed dramatically, and he landed with a thunderous crump that cracked the ferroconcrete beneath his feet and sent a cloud of dust billowing outwards. He stood there, frozen, for a full 10 seconds, his systems screaming with overload warnings. The entire suit was vibrating from the strain. Warning, structural integrity at 92%. Warning, hydraulic pressure spike detected. Operator vitals, heart rate 180 BPM, critical. He had survived. He was alive. He was standing. He looked down at the spiderweb of cracks his landing had created. A slow, shaky laugh bubbled up from his chest. He'd done it. He had fallen from a 10-story building and walked away. But the test had revealed a critical flaw. It wasn't a mechanical flaw. It was a user flaw. The ARMS had near limitless power, but he, Izuka Midoriya, had no idea how to control it. The interface between man and machine was still clumsy. His instincts were all wrong. He was still thinking like a boy on his own 2 feet, not like a half-ton, steam-powered demigod. He looked at the dial on his forearm, still set to 10%. It was his version of One for All, a power so immense that using it at 100% was unthinkable. He realized, with a sudden, dawning clarity, that his journey wasn't just about building the suit. It was about learning to master it. Learning to master himself. He couldn't just rely on brute force. He had to be smarter. He had to be more precise. He spent the rest of the morning practicing. Not great feats of strength, but small, controlled movements. He practiced walking without cracking the pavement. He practiced picking up a single, small rock without crushing it into dust. He practiced modulating the piston leap system, making a series of small, controlled jumps from one crumbling rooftop to another, his landings getting progressively softer, more controlled. It was during one of these rooftop exercises that he noticed something. His helmet's audio sensors, designed to pick up distant sounds, were registering a faint, rhythmic thump, 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 coming from the heart of Sector Gamma. It was a heavy, percussive sound, too slow for machinery, too regular for falling debris. Curiosity piqued, he made his way towards the sound, his movements now more confident, more practiced. He leaped from rooftop to rooftop, the powerful pistons carrying him across the urban canyons of the dead industrial zone. The sound led him to the ruins of the old etheric power plant, the site of the disaster that had created Sector Gamma. The central reactor building was a collapsed husk of concrete and twisted rebar, a gaping wound in the heart of the district. The thumping sound was coming from inside. He landed silently on the edge of the ruined roof, peering down into the darkness below. The interior of the reactor building was a cavernous space, littered with the corpses of colossal, forgotten machines, and in the center of the chamber, illuminated by a single, dusty shaft of sunlight, was a man. He was a giant of a man, with dark skin and a shaved head. He was stripped to the waist, revealing a physique that was a breathtaking sculpture of muscle and sinew. But what made Izuku's breath catch in his HUD was the man's quirk. His arms, from the shoulders down, were not made of flesh. They were formed from a dense, black, crystalline substance that seemed to absorb the light. He was punching a wall. Or what was left of one. It was a 10-foot-thick, reinforced concrete blast shield, and he was methodically, rhythmically, destroying it. Each punch landed with the heavy thump Izuku had heard, and each impact sent spiderwebs of cracks racing through the concrete, dislodging chunks of rubble the size of engine blocks. He wasn't using his quirk in a flashy way. There were no energy blasts, no transformations. It was just pure, relentless, overwhelming physical power. It was the kind of power Izuku was trying to replicate with his machine. Izuku engaged his helmet's optical zoom, focusing on the man. He saw the intricate network of scars that covered his back. He saw the focused, meditative look on his face. This wasn't a rampage. It was training. He was about to pull back, not wanting to disturb the man, when his foot slipped on a patch of loose gravel. A small cascade of pebbles clattered down into the chamber below. It wasn't a loud noise, but in the cavernous silence, it was as loud as a gunshot. The man stopped punching. He didn't turn around. He just stood there, perfectly still. "I know you're there," the man said, his voice a deep, calm baritone that echoed in the vast space. "Come down. Or I will come up." Izuku's heart leaped into his throat. He was caught. His mind raced. Run? Fight? Fighting seemed like a terrible idea. This man was casually demolishing a blast shield designed to withstand a reactor meltdown. Even with the AR mess, Izuku was a novice, an amateur. He decided on the only sensible option. He activated his external speakers. "I am sorry." His synthesized voice boomed, startling even himself. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I was just passing through." The man slowly turned around. His face was stern, his eyes dark and intelligent. He looked up at the hulking, mechanical figure perched on the edge of his roof. He showed no surprise, no fear, only a calm, appraising curiosity. "A machine," the man said, his voice resonating with quiet power. "You are not automaton constabulary. You are not military. So I ask again. What are you doing in my training ground?" Your training ground?" Izuku stammered. "This place is quiet," the man said. "It allows me to focus. To push my limits without fear of interruption." He took a step forward. "You have not answered my question." Izuku knew he had to respond carefully. He used his piston leap system, but not for a huge jump. He used a short, controlled burst of steam to cushion a drop, landing softly on the floor of the chamber a respectful distance from the man. The sheer size of the ARMS was imposing, but Izuku tried to make his posture as non-threatening as possible. "My name is Izuku Midoriya," he said, his real voice now filtering through the speakers. "And this is the ARMS. It's my project." He gestured vaguely at the suit. "I came here for the same reason you did. I needed a place to test it. A place to train, where I wouldn't hurt anyone." The man's eyes narrowed, scanning the ARMS from head to toe. He saw the crude, utilitarian design, the exposed piping, the scarred metal. He saw that it was not a mass-produced machine, but something personal, something handcrafted. "You built this?" he asked, a note of genuine surprise in his voice. "Yes," Izuku said. "Every piece." The man was silent for a moment, then he looked at Izuku's gauntlet fists, then back at the pulverized blast shield. "You seek power," he stated. It was not a question. "I seek The ability to help, Izuku corrected softly. The power is just a tool. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the man's lips. A fine distinction. Many forget it. He crossed his crystalline arms over his massive chest. My name is Hakiji Tengai, and I, too, seek the ability to help. Izuku's internal database, culled from years of hero worship, clicked into place. Hakiji Tengai. Quirk barrier. Pro-hero, Rampart. A defensive specialist, renowned for his ability to create impenetrable shields. A sidekick currently, for the number 4 hero, Fat Gum. But what was he doing here, training for overwhelming offense? As if reading his mind, Tengai gestured to the broken wall. A barrier is useless if it cannot withstand the storm. And the storms are getting stronger. I must be stronger too. He looked back at Izuku. You have a powerful machine, Izuku Midoriya. But from what I observed of your arrival, you lack control. Your power is a wild beast. It will destroy you before it ever helps anyone, if you do not learn to tame it. I know, Izuku admitted, the word heavy with the frustration of his earlier fall. That's what I was trying to do before I found you. Tengai nodded slowly. He looked at the rising sun, its light now flooding the ruined chamber. This is a good place to train. Quiet. Empty. He turned his gaze back to Izuku, and his expression was one of serious consideration. We both seek the same thing, Tengai said. Control. Precision. Strength in the service of others. Perhaps we can seek it together. It was not an offer of friendship. It was not an offer of mentorship. It was a challenge. A proposal from one serious warrior to another. Izuku looked at the pro-hero, at the shattered wall, and at his own mechanical hands. He had come here to test his machine. He had come here to see if he could survive its power. But now, he had found something far more valuable. He had found a benchmark. He had found a purpose for his training. And unexpectedly, he had found a partner. Okay, Izuku said, his voice clear and steady through the speakers. Tengai gave a single, sharp nod. He turned back to the wall. Good. Then our training begins now. Show me what your machine can do. Strike the wall. Izuku took his stance, the pistons in his legs hissing as he rooted himself to the ground. He looked at the wall, then at the man standing calmly beside his target. He set the dial on his arm to a steady 20%. The power coursed through him, a familiar, exhilarating hum. This was no longer just a test run. This was his first day of school.